What's up, everybody? My name is Joe Brown and this is Heresy Financial. Seems like more and more people are throwing around the word stagflation these days. And while it might seem like common sense to some people, I thought it might be a useful thing for me to just precisely define what stagflation is, especially because for a long time, most economists thought stagflation was a contradiction, that it was actually impossible, until obviously it happened in the 70s and has happened a lot since then. So in this video, we are going to define exactly what is stagflation, how you can measure it yourself, and as a bonus, we'll look at all the other flations as well. Ready? Let's dive in. All right, so because stagflation uses inflation as part of its definition, we have to start there first. Inflation and deflation. Historically, these words were meant to describe either the expansion or the contraction of the total supply of money. The result of either inflation or deflation was the rise in prices. That was a long time ago, and nobody uses the words with that definition anymore. Therefore, it's not helpful in conversation with the normal person to redefine inflation and deflation and say, oh, no. The original definitions of those words meant the expansion or the contraction of the money supply. It's useless. It is far more helpful to just use modern vernacular, use the current definitions of words, because guess what? Languages change over time. Use the modern definitions and then accurately describe what's actually going on. Hey, you're talking about inflation happening? Well, the reason that inflation happens is because of the expansion of the money supply. Who cares if 100 years ago the definition was different? That's the definition today. All right, so now we have inflation and deflation today are the rise or the fall in the general level of prices. Now that is measured officially in America by the CPI, the Consumer Price Index. Many people say that that official number is drastically understated, and there are private estimates of what inflation is that go off of different definitions, different metrics, different ways to measure it, whether it's by city or using prior rules before the Bureau of Labor Statistics changed how it was measured. There's all sorts of different ways to measure inflation, but the CPI is the most common one. All right, so we've got inflation and deflation. Let's take inflation and add the word hyper in front of it. Technically, there is no strict absolute definition of hyperinflation, but the one that is most commonly used is 50% per month. And so what 50% per month looks like is a heck of a lot more than we see in the United States, is a heck of a lot more than what we've seen in most countries around the world. There are a few that are currently experiencing hyperinflation right now, but hyperinflation, technically, most people who use a technical definition are saying 50% every single month. So if you go out and buy a pizza, $10. Next month, you go out and buy that same pizza, it's $15. Month after that, you go out and buy the same pizza, it's $23. The month after that, you go out and buy the same pizza, $35. You're experiencing hyperinflation in pizza prices. That's 50% or more every single month. So we see the word hyperinflation thrown around a lot, especially in America, but hyperinflation, 50% per month, we are still a long way off from that. All right, so we looked at inflation and then hyperinflation. We looked at deflation. Now let's look at disinflation. The reason is because many people accidentally conflate disinflation and deflation. We know that inflation means that prices are going up over time. If every year prices rise by 5%, you have a 5% rate of inflation. Very easy, right? Well, what happens if this year prices rose by 5%, then next year prices rise by 4%, year after that prices rise by 3%? Is there still inflation? Absolutely, prices went up by 3%, but the rate at which prices are increasing is decreasing. So prices aren't decreasing, it's just the rate at which prices are increasing is decreasing. That is what disinflation is. It means you still have inflation, you still have prices going up, but the rate at which those prices are going up is slowing. It's like if you're driving in a car. You're driving forward and you step on the brakes. You're still moving forward, you're just not accelerating anymore, you're slowing down. Still moving forward, you're not moving backwards, that would be deflation. You're slowing down down, and if it continues, you would eventually come to a stop. And now we get to stagflation, which, like I mentioned, for many decades, most economists thought that stagflation was an impossibility because stagflation is simultaneously prices going up and economic stagnation, economic decline, or a lack of economic growth. The reason why people thought that that was impossible is because one of the main ways that economic growth is measured is by employment or unemployment. And the relationship between employment and inflation is measured by the Phillips curve, which even Jerome Powell recently admitted within the last year and a half, that the Phillips curve is broken. Doesn't work anymore. And the reason is because basically this Phillips curve says that if you have prices going up, you can't also have unemployment going up, because where is the money coming from that's contributing to the higher prices? This is why prior to the 70s, again, most economists thought it wasn't possible because the expansion of the money supply had a leash on it. You didn't have governments with the ability to print an infinite amount of money, expand that money supply infinitely. There was a leash on it called the gold standard. But as soon as that ended, you entered into a period of stagflation, very high inflation and economic pain for a long time. And since then, pretty much every time we've had any sort of recession, economic downturn, lack of economic growth, you still see prices going up. Now, one of the easiest ways to understand how you can have prices rising while unemployment also rises is something that we recently experienced within the last year and a half. Helicopter money. If you have a central government financed by the central bank, they spend money into existence and they spend that money on helicopter checks, hand that money out to people. Is that going to help unemployment or hurt unemployment? Well, at the very best, it cannot help, because you will have at least some people for at least some amount of time who will not work because they don't have to, because they're getting money from the government in order to stay home. We've seen that. So at least for the short term, something like helicopter money or universal basic income or stimulus checks, these are mechanisms by which you can have inflation go up and unemployment get worse. Because all that new money that's handed out to people, that is going to be spent. The average person, when they get money, they spend it. They don't save it. They don't invest it like they're rich. That money gets spent in the economy. All that money bids up the prices of all the existing goods and services, because the printing of money didn't, at least at the beginning, create new goods, didn't create new services. And so all of that new money entering the system bids up the prices, just like it would if you're playing Monopoly and the banker decides to double everybody's money around the board. Eventually, all of the prices of the properties are going to go up. All the rents are going to go up because everybody has money to put houses and hotels on their properties. And so when you double the money in a system, when you expand the monetary supply, that's going to increase prices. Now, there's an argument that eventually all that new money bidding up the prices will lead to corporations having to increase wages in order to attract better labor. That's going to increase income, and that's going to spark higher inflation, but eventually that will also result in higher productivity because you have higher growth, you've got higher prices leading into higher revenues and profits for businesses, and so you have better economic growth, more hands into the people that can spend on the things that make the things run. So over the long term, there's an argument to be made that I disagree with, that printing money and handing it out will eventually result in growth. But at least for the short term, you get what's called stagflation, where you have higher unemployment, lower economic output, and at the same time, prices are rising. And then finally, what's the way that you can measure it? Look at it yourself. This is something called the misery index. And it's called the misery index because it adds two things together. Number one, unemployment. Number two, inflation. Take a look with me at this chart of the US misery index. This goes back to 1948. And so this is obviously going to be using the official numbers for inflation and the official numbers for employment. You can see there are spikes and there are long-term trends as well. So leading up until it spiked in 1980, that was a long-term trend where inflation plus employment was trending upwards. It was trending higher. Since then, it has been going down. However, it looks like from the period of 2015 through about 2019, we put in a strong bottom, and we are going to be embarking on a new long-term trend up. Now, as with anything in economics, whenever describing mechanisms, how things work, it's always with the clause ceteris paribus, all else being equal. And if you'll notice, from about 1980 through about 2000, the misery index went down, and it dropped extremely quickly. Why is this? Well, one thing that happened during this time was the technological revolution, the internet, computers, massive productivity gains sweeping the world. Just an explosion in productivity, an explosion in growth and capabilities of what one person could output with the same amount of labor. So when you have these massive explosions in productivity from new innovations or inventions, technological revolutions, you can absolutely cover up the negative consequences of bad monetary policy. But that's a story for another time. I hope it was helpful for you to hear the differences between inflation, deflation, disinflation, and what stagflation is and how you can measure it using the misery index. As always, really appreciate you guys. Thanks so much for watching. Have a great day.